All right, let's start here this evening. So the United States has officially withdrawn climate change funding to South Africa for the just energy transition. The International Relations Department says it notes the decision and remains committed to the implementation of international agreements, including those signed at the Paris conference. It forms part of U.S. President Donald Trump's reprioritization of funds. Indonesia and Vietnam are also affected, and it applies to projects in planning and implementation phases. Now, the Just Energy Transition Plan relates to the country's shift from coal-based energy to renewable sources. Well, independent energy analyst Clyde Mallinson joins us to give us a reaction to that, those news coming out this afternoon. Clyde, a good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us. I want to ask if you were surprised.
Good evening, Naledi.
Yeah, no, appreciate your time. I want to ask if you were surprised. I think many of us were expecting that, relationships are souring between the U.S. and South Africa, and certainly the U.S. and other countries. But did you see this coming?
Yeah, not surprised at all. I'm just surprised it took quite as long as it took because the U.S. Government under the leadership of Donald Trump has, it's withdrawn from the Paris Climate Agreement, and it's done everything to turn its back on the new disruptive energy technologies of wind, solar, and storage, and it's doubling down on fossil fuels. And good luck. Good luck with that.
Sure. My question obviously is what happens now, because the amounts that we're talking about, so the 2021 pledges were, $56 million in grant funds, $1 billion in potential investments commercially. That is, so, I mean, big amounts that we're talking about. How do you characterize how much of a loss this is and also its impact for our own transition?
Well, I think one needs to just take a step back and look at the thing in perspective. So first of all, the pledge originally, the original pledges were just over $9 billion, of which America pledged around about $1 billion of concessional, or not actually concessional, of commercial funding, with, as you correctly said, about $56 billion of grant funding. And much of that grant funding actually flows and finds its way back to American consultants who are working with South African consultants, but basically tapping into that $56 million of funding to carry out study after study after study of what should be done. But why I'm wanting to dial it back slightly is that the original intent of this funding was to accelerate the shutting down of our coal fleet. And when I say accelerate, we're due to decommission our coal fleet on a schedule. And the idea with climate finance is to say anything that you were due to do can't attract concessional and grant funding. It has to be additive. So you have to show us that you're going to do something extra in order to speed up your decarbonization efforts. And if you do that, then we will make grant and concessional funding available. So the original deal was struck saying that we're due to close down half a dozen coal-fired power stations over the next 8 years or so. Maybe if we can close them down over the next 6 years instead of 8 years, we'll give you some funding to help you do that a little bit more rapidly. And so that was the initial gist of that funding. Now, when we look at the cost of transitioning from our current fossil fuel-based energy system to a renewable system, the cost is often touted as about $100 billion, which is close to 2 trillion rand. And that's seen as a cost. Well, I prefer to see it differently. I see it as an investment. And if we invested $100 billion in a new renewable fleet to move us in tandem with the disruption that's happening globally in the energy supply industry, then we would get returns from that investment. So it's not as if it's going to cost us that amount of money. We're being asked to invest that amount of money, and the returns we would reap from that investment would basically, what I like to say, would be better than the returns that most people get from their pension fund investments.
Yeah.
So it's an investment, it's not a cost. So we actually don't need any finance from any countries. But hey, if they want to give us concessional funding at lower interest rates than we can generate normally, then it'll help us speed up the process.
Yeah.
But it's certainly not necessary. The transition is cost saving, not cost requiring. And much of the contestation actually is about who's going to benefit from those saved costs.
I want to expand it to, I suppose, the biggest sort of energy politics, if you'll allow me. You know, a lot of the African countries going into some of the COP meetings, for instance, wanting to negotiate for more climate funding into the continent. And the argument made is, well, Africa contributes, 4% to carbon emissions? A lot of that
Could be
debate.
something like that.
Yes, yeah. And a lot of the time then what happens with African countries is they argue that funding must come from outside because otherwise coal-fired power stations and coal-based energy helps us to industrialize. What does that do for that debate here in South Africa?
Well, you know, just because other countries built much of their industry on the back of coal doesn't necessarily mean we have to. If they had had the alternatives that we now have, and those alternatives are renewable energy that come in not just less expensively than coal, but they bring with them clean air, climate benefits. You know, the costs of health of burning fossil fuels are greater than the cost of generating energy. So the number of deaths and people who suffer from illnesses due to pollution from fossil fuels, the cost of that to our, the externality cost, as it's often referred to, is actually greater than the cost of producing the electricity. So, you know, we can say, well, because the world had a world war for the Second World War, why don't we have another world war? It's our turn, you know. I just think we're incredibly fortunate that at a point where our coal fleet is due for retirement, we're lucky enough to be at a point in time where the alternatives are viable.
Yeah.
Had our coal fleet required replacement 20 years ago, we wouldn't have even been able to look at renewable energy and storage as an alternative because it was just too expensive.
Yeah.
It's now the cheapest form of energy. So aren't we lucky?
Yeah.
I see it as a marvelous opportunity rather than an expensive cost.
That World War analogy is quite the analogy, Clyde.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let me do this because I think that
we were involved. To be fair, we were involved in the World War. But you get my point.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
And follow what happens in other countries to say because they put in this, we have to do it. You know.
So the point is, do not repeat the sin committed. This is what I think most matters to the viewer, and I mean to every South African, myself included. We just want to know how this is going to impact our daily lives. We recently had something like more than 300 days without load shedding. We had a horrible return briefly recently. What does this mean for energy availability for us as South Africans moving forward?
This restriction or the withdrawal of these funds means absolutely nothing because we haven't actually committed and spent any of those funds yet. We've dabbled a bit with the grant funding, but we've diverted some of the funds from their original intention to green hydrogen and to EVs and all sorts of things. The original intention of that funding was to accelerate the decarbonisation of Eskom's coal fleet. The good news, and this is my particular view on a just transition, is that we are going through an energy transition whether we like it or not, whether it's kicking or screaming or not. What I would like to see is that inevitable transition is paralleled with an economic transformation. And to explain that, there's options on the table where 10 million or more ordinary South Africans who normally couldn't raise loan finance for a house or a bond or something would actually be empowered to be able to own or to fund that new fleet of renewable energy. And they would get dividends from that fleet that would allow them to pay back the funding they had taken out to build that fleet. And when that was paid off, they would then have pensions. So I see a just energy transition not just as giving coal workers jobs, because we certainly didn't help out the gold mine workers when they lost their jobs. We should be looking to empower South Africans to actually have an ownership component of the new fleet.
Yeah.
Sort of widespread public ownership of the renewable fleet.
Yeah.
That to me would be a just transformation, a
Yeah.
grassroots transformation.
That's a big discussion that you're opening up. Then perhaps we'll have it another time, Clyde. But we really do appreciate your time. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Clyde Mallinson there, independent energy analyst, responding to the news where the Trump administration has withdrawn funds for the Just Energy Transition Partnership with South Africa.